In the humid, high-ceilinged war rooms of Tokyo in 1941, the air was thick with a dangerous kind of certainty. The Imperial General Staff, men steeped in ancient codes of Bushido, looked across the Pacific and saw a giant they believed was made of straw. To the Japanese High Command, war was not a matter of machines or factories, but a clash of spiritual will. They coined the term Seishin, the invincible fighting spirit, and they believed it was a weapon that no amount of American steel could ever match. This was the samurai's miscalculation, a fatal error in judgment that would lead an entire generation of Japanese soldiers into a specialized kind of hell. The Japanese generals viewed the American soldier with open contempt. In their eyes, the Americans were decadent city boys, soft creatures of comfort who lacked the stomach for the cold brutality of the bayonet. They argued that the Americans' reliance on technology was actually a sign of weakness, a crutch for a man who was afraid to die. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a man of immense pride, embodied this arrogance. When he was sent to Guadalcanal to dislodge the U.S. Marines, he didn't prepare for a modern war of attrition. He prepared for a glorious demonstration of Japanese superiority. He told his men that the cowardly Americans would flee the moment they heard the scream of a banzai charge. But on the night of September 13, 1942, at a place that would become known as Edson's Ridge, the miscalculation turned into a massacre. Kawaguchi ordered his elite infantry to charge into the dark, expecting the Marines to crumble under the psychological weight of the samurai spirit. Instead, he encountered something his philosophy could not explain: the cold, mechanical efficiency of American fire. The Marines didn't run, they stayed in their foxholes and unleashed a sustained volume of fire that the Japanese had never imagined possible. It wasn't a duel of spirits, it was a slaughter by math. Kawaguchi watched in horror as his best troops were cut down by the hundreds, not by superior bravery, but by superior firepower. The Americans didn't wait for the bayonet. They used artillery, mortars, and rapid-fire rifles to erase the Japanese lines before they could even get close. In his private diaries, the tone of Japanese officers began to shift from arrogance to a haunting realization. They discovered that while their soldiers were willing to die for the emperor, the Americans were equipped to make them die before they could even reach the enemy. The samurai's miscalculation was the belief that will could stop a bullet. By the time Kawaguchi retreated into the jungle, leaving thousands of his men dead on the ridge, the myth of the soft American was dead. The Japanese generals had prepared for a war of heroes, but they found themselves in a war of industries. They had banked everything on the spirit of the sword, only to realize that the Americans had brought a factory to the battlefield. The giant was not made of straw. It was made of reinforced steel, and it was just beginning to wake up.
In the dense jungles of the South Pacific and the volcanic caves of the Central Pacific, the Japanese High Command began to witness a phenomenon that defied their understanding of reality. It wasn't just that the Americans were winning battles, it was the impossible, overwhelming scale of their rival. To the Japanese soldier, surviving on a handful of maggot-filled rice and a few rounds of ammunition, the United States military didn't look like an army, it looked like a moving city. This was the realization of the logistics of death, the moment Japanese generals understood they were not fighting a war of men, but a war of factories. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the commander at Iwo Jima, was one of the few who truly grasped the hopelessness of the situation. Having served as a military attaché in the United States before the war, he had seen the rolling assembly lines of Detroit and the endless steel mills of Pittsburgh. In his letters home, he warned that America's productive capacity was beyond imagination. While Japanese generals in Tokyo were still talking about the glory of death, Kuribayashi was watching American bulldozers land on the beach. He noted with a bitter irony that while his men were digging caves with hand tools, the Americans were using massive machinery to reshape the island's geography in a single afternoon. The disparity was psychological torture for the Japanese officers. They watched through binoculars as American Higgins boats vomited endless streams of jeeps, tanks, and crates of fresh supplies. They saw American soldiers sitting on the beach eating chocolate, smoking fresh cigarettes, and, most insultingly, eating ice cream from specialized barges dedicated solely to frozen treats. To a Japanese officer, this was a terrifying display of surplus. If the Americans had enough industrial power to ship ice cream across 10,000 miles of ocean, how could Japan ever hope to match their production of shells and planes? The statistics of the era bear out this nightmare. By 1944, for every single aircraft Japan produced, the United States was rolling 5 off the lines. For every ton of supplies a Japanese soldier received, his American counterpart was backed by 4 tons. Japanese General Hitoshi Imamura once remarked in frustration that the Americans fought as if they had a limitless supply of everything. He described scenes where American artillery would pound a single Japanese pillbox with 1,000 shells just to avoid risking a single squad of infantry. To the Japanese, who cherished every bullet as a gift from the emperor, this was not just warfare, it was industrial extermination. The war of factories eventually broke the back of the Japanese resistance. The generals realized that no amount of samurai spirit could stop a fleet that grew larger every time it appeared on the horizon. They were being drowned in a sea of logistics, crushed by an enemy that had turned the entire North American continent into one giant, unstoppable weapon. The war was no longer about who was braver. It was about who had more steel, more oil, and more fire. And the Americans had everything.
In the humid, vine-choked shadows of the Pacific Islands, Japanese infantrymen began to report a terrifying new phenomenon. They whispered of an invisible machine gun that every American seemed to carry. To the veteran soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who were trained with the bolt-action Arisaka Type 38, a rifle that required a manual flick of the wrist after every single shot, the speed of American fire was not just superior, it was supernatural. This was the Garand Shock, a tactical crisis that shattered Japanese frontline doctrine and left their commanders searching for answers that didn't exist. At the heart of this panic was the M1 Garand. It was the first semi-automatic rifle to be issued as the standard infantry weapon of a major power. While a Japanese soldier could fire perhaps 10 aimed shots a minute in a frantic state, an American private could unleash 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. Japanese officers, observing battles from a distance, were initially convinced that the Americans were deploying an impossible number of light machine guns. They simply could not fathom that a standard rifleman could produce such a continuous wall of lead. The tactical reality on the ground was devastating. In the dense jungle, where engagements happened at close range and in split seconds, the volume of fire became the deciding factor of life and death. A Japanese squad would launch a coordinated ambush, firing their first volley and then pausing to work their boats. In that 3-second window, the American squad would react with a violent rhythmic roar. The Garand didn't pause, it didn't stutter, it just kept firing. Japanese soldiers found themselves suppressed and pinned down by single riflemen who had the firepower of an entire Japanese section. The psychological toll was even heavier than the physical one. Japanese field reports from the Philippines and Burma described the American soldier as a mechanical monster. One captured Japanese diary noted,
We were told they were weak, but they fight like demons with guns that never empty. When we wait for them to reload, they are already firing again." The iconic ping of the M1 clip ejecting was supposed to be a signal of vulnerability, but in the chaos of a firefight, it was often a trap. The Americans fought in pairs. While one Garand pinged, the other was already hot. Japanese generals realized too late that their reliance on one shot, one kill was a relic of a bygone era. They had focused on the spirit of the bayonet, while the Americans had focused on the physics of the firefight. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi would later remark on the futility of traditional charges against such weapons, noting that his men were being systematically erased before they could even draw their blades. The M1 Garand had effectively stripped the Japanese of their last advantage, the close-quarters ambush. In the war of factories, the Garand was the ultimate product, a machine designed to make the samurai spirit irrelevant 8 rounds at a time.
For the Japanese soldiers entrenched in the limestone caves of Saipan or the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the sky and the sea had ceased to be elements of nature. They had become sources of industrial-scale slaughter. This was the Steel Reign, a period where the American military turned the concept of a fair fight into an obsolete memory. Japanese generals who had once dreamed of a decisive naval clash on the open ocean now found themselves presiding over a helpless, one-sided massacre. They were no longer fighting a war. They were being systematically erased by the most concentrated firepower in human history. The sheer weight of American naval bombardment was something the Japanese High Command had never prepared for. Off the coast of every target island, the horizon was thick with U.S. battleships and cruisers. These were not just ships, they were floating batteries of heavy artillery. When the 16-inch guns of a ship like the USS New Jersey opened fire, the shells, each weighing as much as a small car, would scream through the air with the sound of a freight train. Japanese General Yoshitsugu Saito, during the defense of Saipan, wrote in his final reports that his positions were being pulverized by a force that no spirit could withstand. He described the earth literally shaking under the weight of thousands of tons of explosives, turning solid rock into fine powder and burying his men alive in their own fortifications. Above this naval fire came the aerial supremacy of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Navy's carrier wings. The Japanese looked up to see a sky black with planes. It wasn't just the fighters, it was the arrival of the B-29 superfortress and the relentless carpet bombing. The Japanese commanders were horrified to find that their traditional camouflage and deep tunnels were no longer a sanctuary. The Americans had developed napalm, a sticky, burning jelly that turned caves into ovens. General Hitoshi Imamura remarked that the Americans did not seek to outmaneuver the Japanese. They simply incinerated the ground until nothing was left to defend. The Steel Reign created a profound sense of psychological helplessness. Japanese field officers reported that their men felt like ants being crushed by a giant's heel. There was no honor in this kind of death. There were no swords drawn, no eyes met. There was only the roar of the engines and the whistling of the falling steel. Japanese generals realized that the Americans were using material superiority to buy the lives of their infantry with shells. For every American life the U.S. military feared to lose, they spent 10,000 pounds of explosives. In his final messages, General Saito noted that the bombardment is so intense that the island is literally shrinking. The Japanese were forced to admit that the age of the warrior had been ended by the age of the bomb. The Steel Reign was the final proof that the samurai's bravery was a useless currency in a world where the Americans could rain fire from the horizon without ever seeing the face of their enemy.
In the flickering candlelight of a damp, sulfur-choked cave on Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi sat down to write his final words to the Imperial Palace. Outside, the world was ending. The ground vibrated with the relentless thud of American 16-inch shells, a rhythmic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of a dying empire. For years, the Japanese High Command had preached that Seishin, the spiritual will, was invincible. But as Kuribayashi put brush to paper, he was forced to deliver the final confession. The truth was cold, hard, and undeniable. The spirit was not enough. This was the moment of clarity that reached the highest levels of the Japanese military. The generals who had once boasted of a 100-year war were now witnessing the total collapse of their ideology. In his final telegram, Kuribayashi did not speak of glory or the beauty of the cherry blossom. Instead, he apologized to the emperor for his inability to stop the American machine. He wrote, "The weapons of this enemy are beyond anything we imagined. We have fought with our hearts, but they have fought with the power of the sun and the strength of the earth's steel." It was a confession that spiritual bravery was a thin shield against industrial extermination. This sentiment echoed across the Pacific. In the caves of Okinawa, General Mitsuru Ushijima faced a similar reality. He watched as his elite units, men who had trained for a decade in the art of the sword, were simply vaporized by American flamethrower tanks and satchel charges. There was no decisive battle of heroes. There was only a systematic clearing of a map by an enemy that treated war like a construction project. Ushijima's final letters reflected a deep, bitter realization. Japan had lost the war not in the jungle, but in the factories of Detroit and the laboratories of Los Alamos. The confession was not just about the defeat of an army, but the death of a myth. The samurai spirit had been the backbone of Japanese identity, a belief that the Japanese soul was special, untainted by the materialism of the West. But the American firepower, the steel rain, the invisible machine guns, and the radar-guided salvos had proven that the laws of physics do not care about the purity of the soul. The Japanese generals realized too late that they had sent a generation of young men to fight a ghost. They had asked for a miracle, and the Americans had answered with an assembly line. As the final bunkers fell, the messages sent back to Tokyo changed from defiant promises of victory to somber warnings. They told the leadership that the Americans were not soft or cowardly, as they had been told. They were a people who had mastered the machine, and in doing so had become the masters of the night and the day. The final confession was the ultimate acknowledgement of reality. Bravery is a virtue, but in the age of modern war, logistics is a god. The spirit was willing, but the steel was stronger. And for the Japanese Empire, the realization had come only after there was nothing left to save.